The invitation sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I finally sealed the envelope. Gold lettering, heavy paper. My name, Amelia Rahman, printed beneath the words, National Excellence in Corporate Leadership Award. For years, my family had reduced my life to a single dismissive sentence. She's just a secretary. They never asked what I actually did, never listened when I tried to explain. Still, a part of me hoped, foolishly, that this night might change something, that they might finally see me. The word secretary followed me like a shadow I couldn't step out of, no matter how far I walked or how much I grew. In my family, labels were permanent, carved early and never revised, and mine was decided the moment I accepted my first administrative role. My father, Amelia Rahman, said it with a dismissive chuckle, as if the title itself explained everything about my ambition, intelligence, and future. At family dinners, weddings, even casual conversations with relatives, he would wave his hand and say, Amelia works as a secretary, leaving no space for curiosity, no pause for follow-up questions, no room for pride. It wasn't just a description. It was a verdict, and everyone around him accepted it without challenge. What hurt most was not the word itself, but the way it was used to shrink me. Every achievement I mentioned was filtered through that single label until it sounded insignificant. If I talked about managing complex schedules across time zones, it became answering phones. If I mentioned coordinating between departments and executives, it turned into organizing files. My sister Nadia never openly mocked me, but her silence carried its own weight. She thrived on admiration, on visible success, on roles that sounded impressive even when explained poorly, while my work demanded understanding to be respected. Over time, I learned that my family didn't misunderstand me. They simply didn't want to understand. At home, the label seeped into how decisions were made. My opinions were gently ignored. My advice politely dismissed, especially when conversations drifted toward careers, finances, or leadership. Dad trusted Nadia's loud confidence more than my quiet certainty, even when my experience clearly outweighed hers. I became the one expected to listen, to support, to stay in the background, reinforcing the very role they believed I belonged in. I noticed how easily people confuse visibility with value, and how quickly they assume that authority must be loud to be real. Outside those walls, my life looked very different. At work, people depended on me. Executives trusted me with confidential information, high-stakes decisions, and impossible timelines. I was the person problems landed on when there was no margin for error, the one expected to fix what others had broken without recognition or applause. My life partner, Ethan, saw the contrast clearly. He watched me prepare briefing documents at midnight, resolve conflicts before meetings even began, and carry responsibility that far exceeded my title. When I told him how my family spoke about me, he looked genuinely confused, as if we were talking about two entirely different people. Still, the label followed me back home every time. It was there in the jokes Dad made, in the way relatives nodded sympathetically when he introduced me, in the subtle comparisons that always placed Nadia a step above. I learned to smile through it, to downplay my frustration, to keep my achievements to myself because explaining them felt like begging to be believed. Over the years, that label hardened into expectation, and expectation into habit, until my family no longer saw me at all. Only the version of me they had decided was easiest to understand, the lowly secretary who fit neatly into their worldview, who didn't challenge their assumptions, who stayed exactly where they were comfortable keeping her. There is a certain kind of work that only becomes visible when it is missing, and for years, that was the kind I did. While my family measured success by titles that sounded impressive at dinner tables, my days were spent in the quiet machinery of efficiency, precision, and anticipation. I wasn't hired to shine, I was hired to make others shine without ever stepping into the light myself. As my role evolved, so did the weight of responsibility on my shoulders, but from the outside, nothing appeared to change. To my family, I was still doing the same small job they had dismissed from the beginning, unaware that the foundation beneath that title had expanded into something vast and demanding. My mornings began before most people woke up, not because anyone asked me to, but because the work required it. I coordinated schedules across multiple time zones, ensuring that executives who never met in person could function as a single, seamless unit. One miscalculation, one missed detail could cost the company millions, yet when everything ran smoothly, it appeared effortless, almost invisible. I drafted strategic briefs, filtered critical information, and often decided what issues needed immediate attention and what could wait, effectively shaping decisions long before they reached the boardroom. It was a role built on trust, but trust rarely comes with applause. Over time, I became the person people came to when something went wrong and they didn't want it to escalate. Contracts stalled, negotiations threatened to collapse, tempers flared between departments with competing priorities, and somehow my name always ended up on the email thread that read, "Amelia, can you handle this?" I learned how to de-escalate conflict with calm language, how to read between lines that were never explicitly written, how to protect my executives from chaos without ever claiming credit for restoring order. None of this fit into the narrow definition my family used to describe my job, so none of it counted in their eyes. What made the disconnect harder to accept was how deliberate the ignorance felt. I tried, in the early years, to explain what I actually did. I talked about projects I coordinated, systems I built, crises I quietly resolved before anyone else even noticed. My father listened with half attention, nodding in a way that signaled patience rather than interest, while my sister glanced at her phone, already bored. Eventually, I stopped explaining. I realized that understanding would require effort from them, and effort was something they were unwilling to spend on a role they had already judged. At home, my work was reduced to a punchline, a convenient comparison used to elevate others. "At least Nadia has ambition," Dad would say, not cruelly, but casually, as if stating an obvious fact. He never saw the ambition it took to master a role that demanded excellence without recognition, to carry responsibility without authority, to remain composed when pressure became relentless. He never saw the nights I came home mentally exhausted, not from physical labor, but from the constant vigilance my job required. To him, exhaustion only counted when it was visible and dramatic. The only person who fully understood was Ethan. He saw the emails that came in at impossible hours, the way my phone buzzed during holidays, the careful balance I maintained between professionalism and emotional intelligence. He knew that my title was a simplification, not a limitation, and he reminded me of that when self-doubt crept in after another dismissive comment from my family. Still, even with his support, there were moments when I wondered how different things might feel if the people who raised me had taken the time to truly see the work I did, the skill it required, and the impact it had, instead of choosing the comfort of a label that kept their understanding simple and their assumptions intact. The invitation felt heavier than it should have when I held it in my hands, as if the thick paper carried not just ink and embossed letters, but years of unspoken tension and restrained hope. I had received the email confirming the award weeks earlier, yet it took me days to even consider telling my family. Part of me already knew how they would react, how the familiar disbelief would surface before I could finish my sentence. But another part of me still clung to the idea that this moment might be different, that maybe seeing the formality of an invitation, the seriousness of the event, would force them to pause before dismissing it. I chose my words carefully when I finally brought it up, explaining that there was an award ceremony coming up, that it mattered to me, that I wanted them there. My father, Kamal, didn't even ask what the award was for. He laughed first, a short, incredulous sound that cut through the room before I had time to breathe. "An award," he repeated, leaning back in his chair as if the idea itself was entertaining. Then he said it, casually and without malice, which somehow made it worse. "Just a lowly secretary." The words landed hard, familiar, and sharp, echoing every time he had reduced my work to something small and forgettable. For a moment, the room felt smaller, as though the walls themselves were closing in around that single sentence. My sister Nadia smirked, the corner of her mouth lifting in quiet agreement, and that expression hurt almost as much as Dad's laughter. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was enough to confirm that she shared his opinion. I stood there, holding the invitation, feeling foolish for expecting anything else. I hadn't asked for praise, only for presence, for the simple act of showing up, but even that seemed like too much to request. The invitation suddenly felt like evidence against me, as if by offering it, I had exposed myself to ridicule I should have anticipated. I tried to explain, my voice steadier than I felt, that it was a national award, that it involved leadership and long-term impact, but the words sounded defensive even to my own ears. Dad waved his hand dismissively, already bored, already done with the conversation. "These companies give awards for everything," he said as though generosity were the only explanation. "They want employees to feel special." His certainty left no room for doubt, no space for curiosity, and I realized that he had already decided what the truth was long before I spoke. As the laughter faded and uncomfortable silence settled over us, I felt the familiar urge to retreat, to downplay the whole thing, to say it wasn't a big deal after all. That instinct had been shaped by years of moments like this, by learning that enthusiasm would only invite mockery and that pride was something safer to experience in private. I folded the invitation slowly, my hands betraying the tension I was trying to hide, and told them the date and time anyway, my voice quiet but firm, as if saying it aloud might make it real. What surprised me was not their reaction, but my own. Instead of anger, I felt a strange clarity settle in. Their laughter wasn't new, and it wasn't personal in the way it once felt. It was simply consistent with who they had always been. The disappointment was still there, heavy and aching, but beneath it was a growing sense of resolve, an understanding that whether they came or not, whether they believed me or not, this moment belonged to me. I left the room shortly after, invitation tucked safely away, carrying with me the weight of their dismissal and the quiet determination to let the night of the ceremony speak in ways I no longer needed to explain. The night of the ceremony arrived with a calmness that surprised me, as if the storm of doubt and anticipation had already passed and left behind a strange, steady resolve. The venue was an expansive auditorium bathed in warm light, its polished floors reflecting chandeliers that glimmered like restrained celebration rather than excess. As I walked in beside Ethan, the low murmur of conversation surrounded us, measured voices, confident laughter, the subtle hum of people who knew they belonged in rooms like this. I adjusted the simple dress I had chosen, not flashy, not apologetic, and reminded myself that this evening was not about spectacle, but acknowledgement. My family arrived shortly after, noticeably out of place in their stiff posture and wandering gazes. My father's expression carried a mix of curiosity and skepticism, as though he was still waiting for the moment when the illusion would break and prove him right. Nadia scanned the room with thinly veiled judgment, assessing the decor, the crowd, the scale of it all, clearly recalculating expectations she hadn't planned on revising. They took their seats quietly, and I felt the familiar tension coil in my chest, that old instinct to brace myself for disappointment, even in a room filled with possibility. When the ceremony began, the host's voice echoed across the auditorium with practiced confidence, introducing category after category, story after story of leadership and impact. Names were called, applause followed, and I listened as each recipient's accomplishments were outlined in careful detail. The weight of the evening grew with every passing moment, not because I doubted the outcome, but because I knew what was at stake beyond the award itself. This wasn't just about recognition. It was about visibility, about placing truth in front of people who had chosen not to see it. Then, my name was announced. Not rushed, not casual, but spoken with intention. Amelia Rahman, followed by a pause that seemed to stretch time, and then a description of my work that felt almost surreal to hear aloud. The screen behind the stage lit up with projects I had led, initiatives I had built from nothing, measurable impacts that carried numbers too large to dismiss as coincidence. The room leaned in, applause rising as my role was explained in terms my family had never bothered to ask about. I felt Ethan's hand close around mine, grounding me as I stood and made my way toward the stage. From the corner of my eye, I saw my father straighten in his seat, his earlier amusement replaced by confusion, then something closer to disbelief. Nadia's confident posture faltered as she read the screen, her expression shifting as recognition slowly took shape. For the first time, the narrative they had built about me was being challenged not by my words, but by undeniable evidence presented to a room full of people who responded with respect and admiration. The applause wasn't polite. It was sustained, affirming, and impossible to ignore. Standing at the podium, the microphone cool beneath my fingers, I took a moment to breathe. I looked out over the audience, past the lights, past the expectations, and felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. I spoke about teamwork, about roles that operate behind the scenes, about how leadership often looks like preparation rather than performance. Every word felt deliberate, not aimed at proving anything, but at honoring the work itself. As I spoke, I sensed the shift happening in the seats where my family sat, a slow unraveling of assumptions they had held on to for years. When I stepped away from the podium, award in hand, the room rose once more in applause, and I realized that the night had already given me something far more lasting than validation. It had placed my truth in the open, under lights too bright for dismissal, and allowed it to stand on its own, no longer dependent on explanation or defense, no longer confined to a label that could be laughed away. I didn't hear my sister's reply at first because it came in a moment so quiet it almost felt private, despite the hundreds of people around us. The applause had softened into a respectful hum, and conversations began to stir as attendees shifted in their seats, still processing what they had just witnessed. I had returned to my place beside Ethan, my heart still racing, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the award. That was when I noticed my father lean toward Nadia, his brow furrowed, his certainty visibly shaken, as if the ground beneath his long-held assumptions had suddenly given way. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, his voice low but strained, the kind of tone he used when reality refused to align with his expectations. "She never said she was doing all that." It was the closest I had ever heard him come to admitting uncertainty about me, and it caught Nadia off guard as much as it did me. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the stage where my name still glowed faintly on the screen, as though she were rereading a story she thought she already knew. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, stripped of the sarcasm and ease she usually wore so confidently. "She did say it," Nadia replied, not looking at him. "You just never listened." The words were simple, almost understated, but they landed with more force than any public confrontation ever could have. There was no anger in her tone, no attempt to defend me dramatically, just a statement of fact that left no room for argument. I felt something shift inside me at that moment, a release I hadn't known I was holding on to. My father went still, his mouth opening slightly as if to respond, then closing again when no justification came easily. For years, Nadia had benefited from his attention, his pride, his unwavering belief in her potential, and now she was quietly acknowledging the imbalance without apology or performance. I realized then that this reply wasn't just for me. It was for herself as well, an unspoken admission that she had been complicit in reducing my life to something smaller because it was convenient, because it kept the family narrative intact. Nadia finally turned toward me and our eyes met for the first time that evening without rivalry standing between us. There was something unfamiliar in her expression, uncertainty mixed with respect and maybe even a hint of regret. She didn't smile, didn't congratulate me, didn't reach out, but the absence of her usual dismissiveness felt like a gesture in itself. I saw her recalculating who I was, not as the sister she had unconsciously competed against, but as a woman who had built something solid and undeniable in her own quiet way. The weight of her reply lingered long after the ceremony continued around us. It reframed years of family dynamics in a single sentence, exposing how much of my invisibility had been a choice made by others, not a failure on my part. Hearing Nadia acknowledge that truth, even indirectly, felt more validating than any apology I might have received. It wasn't reconciliation, and it wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition, and that alone carried a power I hadn't expected. As we left the auditorium later that night, the distance between my sister and me felt different. Not closed, but no longer defined by contempt or comparison. Her reply echoed in my mind, not as a victory over her, but as a quiet turning point, the moment when someone who had once stood comfortably on the side of dismissal finally stepped into awareness, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than all the years she had chosen not to speak at all. By the time the evening drew to a close, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't happened on the stage or in the eyes of the audience, but somewhere deeper and quieter within me. Holding the award felt surreal, not because I doubted I deserved it, but because for so long I had been trained to measure my worth through the reactions of people who never truly saw me. As conversations buzzed around us and congratulations flowed freely, I understood that this night had gently but permanently shifted the way I would define myself going forward. For years, I had carried an invisible burden, a constant awareness of how my family perceived me and how easily their opinions could seep into my own sense of value. Even when I succeeded, there was always a part of me waiting for their acknowledgement, as if their approval would somehow complete the achievement. Standing there now, surrounded by colleagues who spoke to me as an equal, as a leader, that need began to dissolve. I saw clearly how much energy I had spent trying to prove myself to people who were invested in misunderstanding me, and how unnecessary that effort had always been. When I finally spoke again, this time in quieter conversations rather than formal speeches, I noticed how naturally people deferred to my perspective. They asked thoughtful questions, sought my insight, referenced my work with genuine respect. None of them cared about the title my family had fixated on. They cared about results, integrity, and competence. In those interactions, I felt a calm confidence settle into place, one that didn't need to announce itself or defend its existence. It was simply there, steady and earned, steady. My father's silence followed me throughout the rest of the evening. He didn't approach me, didn't offer congratulations, but he also didn't laugh again. For the first time, his absence of commentary felt less like dismissal and more like reckoning. I understood then that redefining my worth didn't require him to change, to apologize, or even to understand fully. It required me to stop waiting for him to do so before allowing myself to stand tall in what I had built. As we stepped out into the cool night air, Ethan wrapped his arm around me, his quiet pride grounding me more than any words could. He didn't need to remind me of my accomplishments. He had always known them, had always treated them as a given, rather than an exception. Walking beside him, I felt lighter, as though something old and heavy had finally been set down. I wasn't shedding my past or my family, but I was loosening their grip on how I measured my own success. Redefining my worth meant accepting that respect earned in silence is still respect. That impact doesn't require permission to exist, and that my value was never tied to how loudly others recognized it. It meant understanding that I could honor my journey without explaining it, that I could take pride in the work I did without justifying its significance. As the city lights blurred past us on the drive home, I knew with quiet certainty that this shift would outlast the applause, the award, and the moment itself, shaping the way I moved through the world from that night forward. By the time the evening drew to a close, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't happened on the stage or in the eyes of the audience, but somewhere deeper and quieter within me. Holding the award felt surreal, not because I doubted I deserved it, but because for so long I had been trained to measure my worth through the reactions of people who never truly saw me. As conversations buzzed around us and congratulations flowed freely, I understood that this night had gently but permanently shifted the way I would define myself going forward.